All right, we're going to look at solving rational equations, and that just means we're solving equations that involve fractions, and then they involve the type of fractions that we've been simplifying and adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. So let's look at this example. 10 over x minus 12 over x minus 3 plus 4 is equal to 0. So my first step when I solve these is to look through the equation and see if there's anything I can factor. And in this case, there's nothing we need to factor. All right, so then I'm looking at this left side of the equation, and I know I need to combine these parts, subtract and then add, to get them into one single fraction. And in order to do that, I need to find some common denominators. So I could find a common denominator between this fraction, and the 4. But instead of worrying about the 4, I'm just going to subtract 4 from both sides of the equation. As long as you do the same thing to both sides, you keep the equation balanced. Now you don't have to do this subtraction of 4. It's just the way that I'm going to solve this one. So then we're left with 10 over x minus 12 over x minus 3. And now we have it set equal to negative 4. Okay, so now I need to go ahead and find some common denominators for these fractions. I'm going to multiply this one by x minus 3 over x minus 3. Remember, we multiply both the top and the bottom because this is just a 1. And then I'm going to multiply this one by x over x. Again, I'm just multiplying by a 1. But now they're going to have common denominators. So I'm going to multiply the numerator and get 10x minus 30. My denominator is x minus 3 times x, and then minus 12 times x, it's just 12x, and my denominator is x minus 3 times x. Now at this, and I still have equals negative 4 for that other side of the equation. Now at this point, I can subtract the fraction. So I subtract across the top, 10x minus 12x is negative 2x. Negative 30 minus, there's no constant over here, so it's just minus 30 all over x minus 3 times x. Remember, the denominator doesn't change when you're adding or subtracting fractions, and that's equal to negative 4. Now at this point, do not distribute this, okay? It's going to be easier when we solve it if we just leave it in factored form, okay? All right. Now at this point, I'm going to use cross products. So I'm going to make this into a fraction over 1, and then I'm going to multiply this, the numerator, by this denominator, and then I'm going to multiply these two. So just multiplying across. So I have negative 4 times x minus 3 times x, and then I have, setting that equal to 1 times this side is just going to be negative 2x minus 30. Okay, now I'm going to just write the negative 4 with the x. That's going to make it easier to distribute to the x minus 3. And then this side, I don't really have to do anything. And now I'm going to go ahead and distribute. So I have negative 4x to the second plus 12x is equal to negative 2x minus 30. Now, we have a quadratic equation because we have x to the second. And to solve quadratic equations, we want to set them equal to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and move these pieces over here. So I'm going to add 2x, and I'm going to add 30 to this side, but then I need to do it over here as well. So then my left side of the equation is going to be negative 4x to the second plus 14x plus 30 is equal to 0. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm looking at this part of the equation and I'm noticing I could factor out a 2. And actually, I'm going to factor out a negative 2 so that this quadratic I'm left with has a leading coefficient that's positive. Usually that makes life a little bit easier. So then I have 2x to the second minus 7x and minus 15 is equal to 0. And at this point, it's so easy to make a little mistake. Just make sure if you distribute it, you end up with what you started with. So that negative 4x to the second plus 14x plus 30. Okay, so now at this point, I'm looking for a way to solve this quadratic. And you could use the quadratic equation. You could try to factor it, and that's what I'm going to do. So I still have my negative 2. And then when I factor this, so you have a couple of options. You could factor by grouping. You could guess and test. It ends up being 2x plus 3 times x minus 5, and that's equal to 0. And then if we want a product of 0, and we have 3 factors here, at least one of these factors needs to be 0. So I'm going to start with this one. If we want x minus 5 to be 0, then x is going to be equal to 5. And on this one, if we want this factor to equal 0, okay, this one, I'm just going to write out. We have to solve it. And we get, need a little more space, we get x is equal to negative 3 over 2, or negative 1.5. And then for this factor, we said x is equal to 5. So those are our 2 answers for this particular equation. Now the last thing you want to do is you want to look at the original equation. So here's what we started off by solving. And then just make sure that your x values that you found don't cause any problems in the denominator. So if you plugged in this here or here, you'd be fine. You wouldn't get a 0 in the denominator. If you plugged in the solution of 5, you'd be fine as well. You wouldn't end up with a 0. Where you'd run into a problem is if you ended up with x equals 3, and then you'd look here and be like, x can't be 3 because you can't divide by 0. So be watching for that as well. But in this one, the solutions would be negative 3 over 2 and 5.